why my proposal is fundamentally Canadian, we do have to go back to Magna Carta. You know, it's a bit like G.K. Chesterton. You're never going to get me through a speech without hearing about it a bit. Magna Carta, which the next speaker will talk about in much more detail, is in 1215, is forced on the king, who is an evil tyrant. Historians like to revise the image of various people, and they've done a good job on a number of monarchs previously hated, including Richard III, but with King John, you just can't wash it off. He was a villain. He was treacherous, he was greedy, he was unreliable, he was lecherous, he was just about everything bad, including cowardly. One of his nicknames was Soft Sword. That's not good. And, yeah, and I'm lacking. Like, it can't be a compliment. But the barons and the churchmen and the knights and the people of England, when they dragged John to Runnymede and gave him a choice between putting his seal on Magna Carta and having his blood spill onto it, were asserting that there were certain fundamental rights in England that came from the people and could not be taken away from the people. They were asserting that the king was subject to the law, that the king did not make the law. And they were not asserting this, by the way, as a novelty. They were asserting that it had always been that way in England, and that the king could not take it away. John of Salisbury, who's writing in the court of Henry II, who is John's father, in his book called Polycraticus, he says the difference between a prince and a tyrant is that the prince is subject to the law. And he went on to say, it is not only lawful to slay the tyrant, it is right and just to do so. So he's actually telling the king, if you don't follow the law, we are personally going to make you dead. And the king, instead of deciding to kill the person who said that, is forced to sit there and smile and say, that's just great, I like that. But it's a remarkable assertion in part because this is pre-Magna Carta. There's no parliament. Parliament doesn't come into existence as a corporate body until the latter part of the 13th century, around 1265 and so on. So what is this law? Well, it is the law that has arisen from the people. It is what the people have always agreed to be governed by. Henry II, who's the almost great King of England, one of the things that he does that earns him that title is that he creates a series of royal courts. And in part, he's having a tussle with the barons over whose courts have jurisdiction. And the reason the king's courts win is because they are more fair. You get better justice from the king than you do from your feudal lord. And what Henry's courts do... Are we being drowned out back there?
We're just amazed at the sound of the deep breath. Cleaning the grill.
Okay. I will shout. I will deepen my voice. The king's court judges went around and they would impanel a jury and say, you must swear on your faith and your honor to tell us what the law is, and then tell us what the facts are in this case. And so it is from the people that they discover what the law is. And Magna Carta is intended to uphold this system, not change it. And so you have the common law of England, the law of the land, emanating from the people, setting limits not only to what the king can do, but to what the parliament can do. The system that the Americans created in 1789 is not an innovation, it's an attempt to preserve that system. And at a critical moment, again, if you want the whole history of the struggle for liberty, obviously what you want is to get the documentary once it's made. But when Charles I comes to the throne, and Charles I, coming from the Scottish royal house of the Stuarts, has no use for Parliament, and he is ignoring Parliament, and so there is a session at which they draft the Petition of Right, reminding the king what the rules really are. And there's some wavering in the House of Lords, people thinking that maybe the king should have some prerogative, some space where his word is law. And Edward Cook, one of the great giants of British history, a guy who'd been Speaker of the House of Commons, Solicitor General, Attorney General, he'd been head of the Civil Court, head of the Criminal Court, he'd been a political prisoner, and in his old age he's back in Parliament. He stands up and he reminds the audience, Magna Carta is such a fellow as he will have no sovereign. That is to say, Magna Carta is a statement of fundamental law in England, and any statute, however properly passed, that contradicts Magna Carta, that infringes the rights of Magna Carta, is void. Exactly the system the Americans adopt in 1789. That there is a constitution coming from the people that limits what laws can be passed and cannot be changed without the consent of the people. And Gradually in Britain, this fades away, partly because Parliament in the 19th century is under such tight control of the people that there seems to be no danger of Parliament passing a law contrary to their liberties. And if you look at 19th century England, the government's down at around 10% of GDP, property rights are secure. There isn't even compulsory education until 1870. The English managed to launch, the British, the Industrial Revolution. Britannia rules the waves, they dominate the world culturally, and they achieve astonishingly high rates of literacy without government coercion. And again, if you read the Sherlock Holmes stories, whenever there seems to be peril, Holmes says to Watson, bring your revolver. And there's nothing controversial about civilian firearms ownership. Watson doesn't say, but I don't have a permit. He says, oh, I don't think, that they want me to have a gun. He just puts it in his pocket, and if anybody tries to hurt Sherlock Holmes, Watson shoots them. This is a society with an enormous degree of freedom, but they lose sight of the fact that there should be things a parliament cannot do, and by the early 20th century, anything parliament does is legally binding in Britain, although obviously if it goes strongly against the popular will, it's not going to prevail. But gradually, this tie with the people gets eroded. By this point, of course, we've set up our constitution, and we've got a written constitution for one reason, above all others, and you know what it is, it's Quebec. That there was no way you could have gotten what was then Lower Canada to join Confederation if there hadn't been a guarantee that a whole lot of powers would stay at the provincial level. And so John A. Macdonald would have preferred not to have a federal system, but he didn't have any choice. The result of this is we got by the back door a constitution that the politicians couldn't mess with. They had to go to Britain, and the British government wasn't going to agree to anything that didn't enjoy strong popular support, including, if you were cutting into provincial rights, strong popular support in Quebec, because they understood that the country would break apart if you did that. So then we get ahead to Pierre Trudeau, who thinks the country's not working very well, which is kind of an odd view, but it was the 1960s, people were a little excited. And so he said, well, this is not fitting. We need to have a constitution that is Canadian, not British. We need to be grown up, as though Canada wasn't grown up in World War II. We had our childlike role in the war against Hitler. And we should have human rights, because human rights are good. But he didn't understand the British system in which rights come up from the people and in which the whole system of law arises from the people. He had much more this top-down vision. He was fighting against some premiers who understood the situation better, others who didn't have a clue what was going on, and in the end, instead of going with the British system where Parliament has complete legal sovereignty, and there's no such thing as an unconstitutional law, or the American system where the people have sovereignty, which I am arguing was the British system, Edward Cook certainly thought so, they produced a document in which neither Parliament nor the people has legal sovereignty. There are laws Parliament cannot pass because they are unconstitutional. So Parliament is not in a position, the British Parliament cannot pass an unconstitutional law, there's no such thing. Anything the British Parliament passes is law, including creating a Scottish Parliament. Westminster can do anything. Dicey once said that Parliament could do anything except turn a man into a woman. Well, Parliament can do that as well now. There's no limit. But while our Constitution moved halfway to the American system by limiting the power of Parliament in all kinds of ways, it didn't move all the way to establishing proper, formal, orderly mechanism of popular sovereignty. And the result is that we have this document, which is profoundly unsatisfactory in a number of ways, and we can't do anything about it, because the people we elect can't change it, and we can't change it. And, in some sense, of course, what this has done, and it's a fairly prominent problem at the moment, is that the court can change it. The Supreme Court, we have a system of checks and balances. The Americans, again, they didn't get this from outer space or from political philosophers dreaming of a new and different world. They got it from the British system, where the executive was checked by the legislature, and there are checks and balances in every direction. But our judiciary is completely unchecked. The only thing that in principle we could do, it is possible for Parliament to impeach judges. It's a power that has not been used in 2 centuries, but I think maybe it's time to dust it off, because to remind judges that law comes from the people. They can't just make it anything they want. They are not divine beings, incapable of error. They are humans, and like all humans, they tend to be corrupted by power. And therefore, there are things they shouldn't be allowed to do, but there are other problems. I mean, one of the things in our Constitution that is a real mess is Aboriginal rights. Because our Constitution, in characteristic bad part of Constitution style, promises Aboriginals everything. It promises them the moon, but it doesn't say how they're going to get there. It gives them this weird capacity to assert sweeping rights, but it's like jewels behind a locked, bulletproof window. They can't actually touch any of it. So there's this enormous uncertainty about resource development and land ownership for non-Aboriginals, but Aboriginals are stuck, unable to get this thing they've been promised. It's a total mess. And you go through, again, time after time, and one of the weirdest things in the Charter of Rights is that it promises, equality of male and female persons. Not just equality before the law, but equality. It promises equalization. It promises multiculturalism. But then it says nothing here extends the power of any legislature. Well, who on earth is meant to do all this if the lawmakers can't do it? The whole thing is a complete botch job because it didn't settle firmly on the British system as it had evolved by the mid-20th century and give it all to Parliament and let us sort it out with our legislators, nor did it put the power in the hands of the people. And this, incidentally, is very different from what happened in 1867. Because Confederation, when the project of Confederation was conceived and the British North America Act was created, there was lively debate throughout the country, and it's worth reading. Finally, we got these debates put together. I think it was 1999 when Bill Gardner and Jen Eisenstadt and others edited we never published our founding debates. Again, Canada falling short of greatness. The Federalist Papers, John A. Macdonald had a copy when he went to Charlottetown, but we just didn't bother. And you listen to these people over and over again, they'll stand up and say, I am a free British subject. And when they're arguing, should we join Confederation, somebody will stand up in the Nova Scotia legislature and say, preserve your British liberties, join Confederation. And somebody across the aisle will stand up and say, preserve your British liberties, don't join Confederation. But the whole debate's taking place within this framework. And then they argue about how can we make fundamental law. What makes the Constitution Act legitimate? Technically, it's an act of the British Parliament, so that the Canadian Parliament can't mess with it and cause Quebec to get all upset. But we understand that legitimacy comes from the people. Should we have a referendum? And some people said, yes, we should have a referendum. Other people said, legislatures are basically sovereign, we can do anything. But the position that prevailed was, the legislature speaks for the people if it has been recently elected by voters understanding that the central question before them is going to be Confederation. So that we are going to the people in the kind of way that you would do in Victorian British parliamentary constitutional monarchy, but we are going to the people. And so Confederation has the stamp of popular legitimacy in a way that the Constitution Act of 1982 does not. It was only passed because Pierre Trudeau had 74 out of 75 Quebec seats. And yet, no Quebec premier has ever dared to sign the document because it's so unpopular in Quebec. They were snookered. They weren't told in the election of 1980 that this is what's going to result. So they didn't agree with it. The rest of the country was not told. None of us were told. And that's no way to make law. It's bad in principle and it's bad in practice. So what it is that we need to do now is to take the Constitution that we have and keep most of it, go through it, editing out those things that are obnoxious, including this thing about internal trade. I don't know why we have to do this, but apparently we have to put in an even stronger clause saying the federal government may and in fact shall see to it that there are no restrictions on the free movement of goods, services, and people within the country. That won't prevent the provinces from carrying out their legitimate powers in a way that sometimes does make it harder for goods and services to move, but it prevents them from using legitimate provincial powers as a backdoor way of simply keeping out things from other provinces, like the fact that coffee creamers are different sizes in different provinces. Have you ever seen somebody look at a cup of coffee and go, wait a minute, there's a Saskatchewan dose of cream in here? No, it's absolute jiggery pokery. The hairdressing needs to be certified differently in every province. If someone learned to cut hair in Quebec, then it's patently obvious that if they should move to Alberta, they'll go and shave fleur-de-lis into people's heads or something. So there are things that need to be changed. I think our Constitution is too centralized, and we could argue about that. That was deliberate on the part of, say, John A. Macdonald, that the federal government has the powers and the provinces don't, and I think that should be done the other way around. But all of this would be within a framework of a constitution that is in fact taken to the people. That by now I think the only way we can do this is to have a referendum. Nothing short of that will be legitimate. And is this a perilous venture? Well, it is. It might lose. Or it might be approved in some provinces and not others. And we need to go into this with our eyes open and understand, what do we do if some provinces don't join? Is there kind of a threshold? If 8 provinces ratify, they're the new Dominion of Canada, and the other 2 can make their own arrangements, though we'd always keep the door open, or do we say we've got to get all 10? There are questions like that that need to be resolved. We also go through and clean up the Charter of Rights. This one needs some additions, including property rights. It needs some serious pruning, and it needs some editing. And I'll give you an example of where it may seem like I'm nitpicking, but this is the kind of thing that's wrong with our charter. It says in clause 26, the guarantee in this charter of certain rights and freedoms shall not be construed as denying the existence of any other rights and freedoms or freedoms that exist in Canada. Now, in a way that sounds good, because the Constitution is not going to extinguish rights, but the problem is it doesn't give any kind of sense of what these rights might be. Whether these might be traditional rights that preserve individual autonomy and dignity, or whether there might be some weird collective right that the Supreme Court is going to find in a moment of overly generous social